teams and building
Good evening, students, and welcome to Chapter 4, Sports Communication and the Cultural Divide. Now, I know that you're all excited to be here with me on Thanksgiving week, and first and foremost, I want to take the time and say Happy Turkey Day to all of you. Now, that doesn't excuse you from our class, but I'm looking out for you. Now, before we get into this week's topic between sports communication and the cultural divide, I want to take a brief look at last week where we discussed the NFL and big business. Right? And why I want to go back and touch up on this topic is because as I was looking through your discussion post, I noticed that this really polarized the classroom. And there was some confusion in regards to how the NFL makes money if they're a nonprofit, right? How does this multi-billion-dollar organization, not have to pay taxes? And that's the first myth right there. That's the first fallacy that I'd like to go over, is to let's get rid of that, because they do pay their taxes. But it's structured uniquely. So first and foremost, you have your research papers that are going to be coming up within the next 2 weeks. And I don't want this topic of confusion to be in that paper. So let's clear these things up now. Now, when we look at the NFL, you see the NFL is a nonprofit organization. Ever since 1942, they've been classified as a nonprofit organization. However, it's structured in an umbrella way. So if we think about it, how in a hierarchy, we have the NFL at the top, right? And then through this umbrella, we have 32 NFL teams, okay? Now these NFL teams all generate different forms of revenue. So they generate revenue through jersey sales, right? Through tickets, through advertising and media, through TV rights deals, and all of these different streams of income are taxed from the NFL team itself. Right? So we can consider these 32 NFL teams as 1099 contracted employees, for instance, right? All under this umbrella. And the NFL organization, which is at the top of this umbrella, is only out to pursue the interests of growing their industry, not out to seek new avenues or new methods for generating income. But now, since they are a nonprofit, they do have to disclose salaries to their high-paying execs and how much money that they're generating as a nonprofit, right? Through other avenues. Now, as of last year, the NFL has decided to start filing for tax exemption and to not be considered a nonprofit. Now, with this switch, it doesn't really make a difference to the NFL because their tax margin was breaking out at zero, where they would have to pay nothing back anyway. But they no longer have to disclose the salaries of their high-paid executives. So if we look at the salary, for instance, of Roger Goodell, who's the commissioner of the NFL, he made $44 million last year that needed to be disclosed. No longer does that need to be disclosed. So there is a point of contention there, right? How much are these execs really making compared to the players that are actually playing the sport and risking their bodies and risking their lives, right? Now, when you're doing your research and you're looking at the big business of the sport, these are the crevices that I want you to focus on, right? These are the cracks within the NFL armor. Look at the power structures, right? The research question that you're trying to answer is, since the NFL has become a global brand and everything that they do is scrutinized meticulously, right? That since it's this global brand, they often have to paint this picture of themselves as being, for the people, right? So they have campaigns like NFL Cares, and they have campaigns like breast cancer awareness, right? Where some of the players will don pink uniforms or pink shoes, pink cleats. Or we have some examples here. Now, in seeing them in this light, right, the NFL has also been known to use exploitative tactics to cultural groups, to power structures, to systems that are in place. And this is where your focus of analysis should be, right? Look at some of the topics that we spoke about last week in regards to college football, right? And how the NFL is structured in a way where they don't have a farm system. Major League Baseball has a farm system, completely paid for through Major League Baseball, right? NHL has farm systems, completely paid for through the NHL. The NFL does not have a farm system. They use college football. They use these student athletes to prove themselves so that they can draft them directly from college, right? How does that affect those institutions? How does that affect those power structures, right? How does that affect academic institutions and scholarships, right? These are the areas that we focused on last week that I would like you to continue doing your research on. Also, look at the cultural message it sends to society. This money that's being invested into youth camps, right? Into specific neighborhoods in the United States, right? These are all points of contention that you want to look for and really dive into your research. I'm looking forward to great papers from every single one of you. This topic is deep and I really want you to test yourselves. All right, now with that said, it's time to get into sports communication and the cultural divide. So what do I mean by the cultural divide? As we've seen through chapters 1 through 3, sports has a way to really segregate us, right? As much as we're trying to come together as a society, as much as we're trying to work cohesively together in groups for the better of mankind, sports has been one of those little areas where it's really kind of been a division for people amongst all different walks of life. It pits brother versus sister, right? Father versus son, husband versus wife, right? But no sports do it more and deeper than combat sports, right? And today we're going to take a look at that. We're going to take a look and examine exactly how sports has the ability to put country versus country, nationality versus nationality, and really perpetuate stereotypes and cultural differences that we may be trying to do away with to become a better society. And we'll look at the moral aspects of that and how the media plays a role in that. So come along and step into my squared circle, because today we're going to use boxing as the lens to analyze how all of this comes together. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's get into the chapter. So we're looking at sports communication and the cultural divide.
Next to me is saying it. You may hear him. Down goes Frazier! Down goes Frazier!
All right, so some learning objectives for tonight. Tonight we're going to look at a history of boxing in America. We're going to understand how cultural poverty and boxing are related, and we're going to take a look at how the media assists in cultural division. First and foremost, why boxing? See, in other sports like football, basketball, hockey, and baseball, they definitely have what it takes to transcend the athletic realm and become a symbol for cultures, to express how a culture may feel, insecurities of the culture, moods of the culture. But no sport does this as well as boxing does. And why? Because boxing itself is visceral. You see, with boxing, it's simple to understand. You take two men, you put them in the squared circle, and you let them hash out their differences, right? In boxing, it's all about how it is framed. And as the promotional companies begin to build these fights, they don't build them off of a team name or a logo or whether the city likes them or not. They build them off of the heritage of the fighter, the nationality of the fighter, the country that fighter represents. And in doing that, all three of those things communicate different things to the society that's going to be backing them. So by the time they step into that ring, they're not fighting for just themselves. They're fighting for a ton of people who represent exactly what that fighter is or what they perceive that fighter to be. Now, in understanding how boxing has become so entrenched in our global society, let's take a look at the history of boxing. You see, early in the 1700s, England is considered the birthplace of modern prize fighting. Now, there are dates that go back past the 1700s, but England has been credited with the structure of boxing. Now, that's all due to the fact of a man by the name of John Broughton. Now, John Broughton was a reigning bare-knuckle champion from 1734 to 1758, and he understood how boxing worked and who was involved in boxing, the social elites that liked to gamble on the sport itself. But he also realized that it needed rules. It needed a little bit more structure than what was happening because it was too barbaric. Now, he implemented two major rules, one being that a fighter could no longer get hit after he's gone to the floor, and two, he kind of showed a new way of how to end fights. So before, fights would end when the fighter physically could no longer move. So now the fighter, if he was not able to make it back to the center of the ring to face his opponent with the help of his camp or by himself after a 30-second count, then the fight was over. He also brought in mufflers, and mufflers are what we now know as boxing gloves. Now, the key thing about this is that it wasn't due to the fighter's safety. It was just brought in because as they would go courting, they didn't want to have any black eyes, bloody noses, or busted lips. So as boxing started to decline in England in the early 19th and 20th centuries, it really started to catch fire here in the States because there was a big immigration boom that was hitting the United States. So bare knuckle showdowns became the norm here between Irish, Italian, natives, and Englishmen that were coming to the United States at the time. Now, this involved the emergence of John L. Sullivan, who many people believe is the next great American after George Washington. You see, John L. Sullivan was the first celebrity boxer that was able to transcend the sport. Now, at this time, boxing still had strong ties with gambling and corruption, but John L. Sullivan, being the first heavyweight champion of the world, was able to get fights sanctioned in states that prior did not want to have anything to do with the sport due to his popularity. Now, this opened up the door for guys like Jack Johnson, and Jack Johnson was the first African-American heavyweight champion of the world. Now, Jack Johnson, obviously being African-American, this didn't sit well with the American public, and they created the Great White Hope campaign, where they would send white boxer after white boxer after white boxer to try in hopes to dethrone Jack Johnson. Well, this culminated in a bout that became really big. And one reason why we were going to focus on this fight is because how the media was able to kind of frame this fight. You see, Jack Johnson versus James J. Jeffries was framed as the ultimate test of racial superiority. And this fight pitted black versus white. And people wanted to see who would win against former champion James J. Jeffries and Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson ends up knocking out James J. Jeffries. However, this fight began to shape how fights were actually being communicated to the public. And now another fight that had notoriety was Joe Louis versus Max Schmeling. You see, Max Schmeling was from German descent, Joe Louis was from American descent. And this was dubbed USA versus Nazi Germany. This polarized the world from Hitler to FDR. And after Joe Louis knocked out Max Schmeling, white America really viewed this fight as democracy beating communism, whereas African Americans viewed this as a step towards ending racial barriers and a step towards equality. Now, if we fast forward to today, boxing today, according to HBO analyst Max Kellerman, he's really the founding father in regards to how cultural poverty and boxing are one and the same. See, he believes to be a strong fighter, you have to come from a meager upbringing. You have to know what it's like to scrap for food on the table. And as cultural groups move up the economic social ladder here in the United States, they lose sight of that, and they have different avenues where they no longer have to indulge in those type of activities. So you no longer see Irish champions, Italian champions, Jewish champions like you did in the early 1900s. But now you see more Hispanic champions, more African American champions, groups, economic, cultural groups that are still on the lower end, because that is the type of mentality you need to have for the sport of boxing. And so it begs the question, if these economic groups are moving out of the boxing landscape, are fights still framed the same? And the quick answer is yes, they are. And we only have to look at this past weekend with Cotto versus Canelo, where we see how they pit Puerto Rico versus Mexico. So even though the boxers change, the nationalities change, the structure of how these fights are being delivered to society remains the same. You see, because at the end of the day, boxing sells best when two different nationalities go head to head. Mayweather versus Pacquiao generated the most money any boxing match has ever seen in the history of boxing, with both fighters taking home nearly $200 million apiece. It also works when politics or culture plays a large role. And we see this when Muhammad Ali took on Floyd Patterson. This was more of a fight between Muhammad Ali and the American public, because this is when Muhammad Ali decided to change his name from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali, which people did not like. It did not resonate well with the American population. Now, this goes on to beg the question, should the media continue to try and create cultural clashes between groups of people solely for monetary benefit? And also, should the promotional companies be held liable for the backlash that ensues after a sporting event negatively affects a marginalized group? These are the points of discussion that we're going to look at in this week's discussion topics. All right, now you have some homework. So answer the discussion questions listed on the previous slide, read chapters 5 and 6, as well as the assigned articles on gender in sports. There was a lot of information given to you today. So please take time to really kind of digest what was said, answer those questions critically, and like always, have a great weekend, have a happy Thanksgiving, and gobble, gobble, gobble.